Another Fabrician for Arian. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just kind of afraid if we take questions on the fly, I'm just going to get lost in my Luddite speaker notes and.
Yeah. Yeah, I would. Yeah. Just we'll collect I'll tell everybody again, but we'll collect the questions in chat, and then when you get done with your presentation, we'll shift on over, and you can take those in order. Hey, Chris is here. Yep.
Had to get used to the difference between Google Meets and Zoom quick, but everything looks like it's working. So good to see everybody.
Good to have another one of Uncle Sam's misguided children here this evening.
Absolutely.
Hi, Michael from Czech Republic's here. All right.
Howdy.
Must be late over. Oh, look, that is the best that is the best background you could have, Michael. Okay. All right, we're up to 18 now, Chris.
Cool.
19.
And Jim is sending a message. It's wanting the link. It's just upstream, I thought. Yeah, Patrick, send Jim a link, would you?
Yeah, somebody else was having an issue. I'm resending a few links here. I think Steve was having an issue, so I'm just, if I don't respond immediately, I'm just,
yeah.
Okay, more links. That's what I do. Okay. I'm like the link opener version of Anna. I can just keep doing this. Okay.
The link dealer.
Yep. Okay, that looks like it's taken. Did you want to try and share your screen to see if it works while we start?
Let's test that, I guess.
Yeah.
Window.
Oh, Steve. Wait.
Nope, that's not it. That's it. Share.
Tu es là, Steve? Tu ça va?
I suppose we let anyone in, don't we?
Oui, je suis là.
Ouais, oh, c'est super ça.
Okay, it looks like it's working for me. Is everybody else seeing the screen?
Everybody else seeing Chris's presentation? Excellent.
Aye, aye. Okay. Okay, I've had about enough of that for the moment. Well, that didn't do what I wanted. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, yeah, no progress, Patrick, on fixing those embedded videos. We'll have to kind of just go forward and back if they don't load up properly. And
yeah, just do what you did in our trial run the other day. Click forward, click back, and that seems to, most of the time catch the video issue. Okay, letting in more people. Oh, I see Larry. Yay, Larry's here. All right, we're up to 23. I know we're at 7:02, but maybe give it another minute or two. The way that these have worked in the past is lots of people, just like I'm doing right now, emailing me and PMing me on a couple social media, getting in. So,
yeah, we can wait just a few.
Yeah.
Verlin, if you don't mind me asking, what's in your pipe? I'm jealous that I'm not in my other room where I have my pipes waiting for me. So can I live vicariously through you? What do you got tonight?
Well, it's a blend. I have the local tobacconist mix up for me. It's 3/4 of a heavy English blend, and then I add a quarter Latakia to it.
All right. It's a little more Balkan leaning. Nice.
Got a couple of others people coming in here. Okay, just give another minute and then we'll get everybody in here. We've got 29 right now, which is pretty close to the amount of people who put it on Facebook. So.
Okay. Well, then I'm just going to take a quick second to point out in the chat bar, I don't know if people are seeing messages in the chat from before you join or not, but I'm going to reshare a Dropbox link in case anybody, well, I say that. Oh, wait. I shared it from my laptop. Let's try this again here.
I can see it in the chat, Chris.
Yeah, but you were here when I shared it.
Oh, okay.
So, and I don't know if everybody gets all the message history or not. So I'm going to share that again. Okay, so if anybody's interested, there are a few documents that I'm probably going to refer to in the course of this, and also my slide set and my speaker notes are there. So there's a few things that I'll refer to, and most of them are translated essays of one sort or another. And I think that may be helpful for people after the fact if you want to dig into this just a little bit more, because a lot of this stuff I can't just kind of sit here and read like I'm a news presenter. So as exciting as me reading in a monotone would be, I'm sure.
All right, so what I'm going to do, Chris, I'm going to do a short intro. I'm going to set some rules of engagement here, and then I'm going to turn it over to you with the presentation. I'll also be watching to admit people and stuff like that and put a link, so I'll do the best I can. So anyways, thank you all for joining. My name is Patrick Bratton. I'm the head instructor of Sala de la Spada Historical Fencing here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And so one thing I've started this year in 2021 is to introduce a kind of guest lecture series, not every week, about twice a month, where I have people come in and talk about history and theory, mostly related to Italian fencing. That's what we do at Sala de la Spada. And we've had a couple of guests so far. We've had Dr. Stephen Hughes, a famous historian of the Italian duel. We've had Maestro John Sellens, who runs the Fencing Maestro program in Sonoma. And tonight, we're very privileged to have monitor Chris Holzman with us. Chris is my fencing guru, as I like to call him. He's the guy who really taught me how to fence, even though I have lots of problems. They're my fault, not Chris's. So Chris is a well-renowned saber fencer and instructor and translator. Many of you who were on this conversation probably have translations that Chris has done of Del Frate, Parise, Marcelli, and a whole bunch of other people. And if you don't, go out and buy those books because they're awesome. So I would like to introduce you to Chris. I just go over a couple of rules of engagement here. So if everyone, make sure that your mics are off while Chris is talking. I see a few people who've got their mics that are still on. We just don't want to catch, your dog or your cat or other stuff running around as Chris is talking. So make sure that your mics are muted. Also, if you've got questions, write them in the chat. And then Chris will do his lecture. After his lecture, he'll end the presentation and he'll start taking questions. And we'll do that. Also, just in terms of rules of engagement and stuff like that here, we'll try to have a professional conversation. So, we don't know the age group of everybody in the audience, so avoid swearing and other sailor-like talk and things like that, right? So we'll try to have a nice professional conversation tonight, and want to make sure that this is available for everybody listening. So without further ado, I wanted to turn it over to Chris.
And I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I will preface this by saying that my real world job kind of gave me unexpected work the last couple of days, which in the pandemic, okay, I'll take it, but it did cut into the prep time. I'm afraid I'm going to be stumbling around just a little bit here between paying attention to the slides and paying attention to my Luddite style notes. I'm going to try not to skip anything. I may jump around a little bit, but I'm going to try to cover what I can. we're going to focus pretty narrowly tonight on the cutting mechanics of Radielli and Sabre as mostly as we would see it early in the development of the system, mid to late 1800s, early 1900s. If we have time towards the end, or maybe if I can seg into it in Q&A, I think I'll try to talk a little bit more about how we got to, say, the 1950s era Sabre from where we started. But initially, I really want to focus in on the cuts themselves. I have another laptop sitting here with a second account logged in, so I can still kind of keep a visual eye on the chat, so I'm not just staring into the void of my great big monitor showing the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and get the presentation bit started and share this. So if you see me glancing down into the right, I'm just trying to get some sense of what's going on. And that didn't share. Let's see here. There we go, maybe.
Looks good.
Kind of at the beginning. I'm going to try to go through it in semi-organized, semi-logical manner. We'll see how that works out. So in the Radielli and Sabre system, we're going to look at the types of cuts, the cutting mechanics on foot and on horseback, and we're also going to look at the tactical applications of these cuts. If I can take just a moment's pause here to... Nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, well, that's better. I can at least see some of you now. Anyway, the tactical applications of cuts we're going to get to at the last, because I think we need to define our terms first. So before we dive into that, let's take a quick look at what kinds of sabers we might see this method used with. Anything that was in use in the Italian cavalry from the end of the 1860s, certainly in the Monferrato cavalry, in which Radielli served in the 59 campaign against Austria. He had already been working with the Monferrato at that point for a number of years. But then it was expanded to include the entirety of the Italian military in about 1868. So what we would have seen at the time are Italian military sabers, as you can see on the slide, from about 600 grams for an 1888 or 1855 infantry officer saber up to a little over 1,000 grams for the 1860 cavalry trooper saber. The fencing sabers of the time were, in the early period, somewhere typically between 600 and 750 grams. Barbasetti, who originally writes his book, let's not make the mistake, as some do, of assuming that Barbasetti's book is in English, so it's 1936. It's a translation of his own earlier work from 1898, 99. So at that point, he's saying a 500-gram saber minimum. Later, post 1915 probably, we start to really get into the 400 to 500-gram sport sabers. But the system scales largely to take those things into account, and we can use it all the way through. I've got a few video clips, assuming they work well enough, that we'll see some of the lighter sabers still being used for what's essentially Radiellian saber. I think we also need to look initially at the guard position. So this is Del Frate's guard of second. It's the primary guard for the bout. It's a guard that's used in the lesson. if you look at the disembodied fellow's arm up here on the upper left side, that's the guard of 4th. If we were to turn his hand over, close the line to the outside, we'd have the guard of 3rd. What we're looking at here is a distance between the feet of, Del Frate says 50 centimeters. I'm guessing based on the proportions that maybe there's a little bit more here. It's certainly a good 2 foot length of your own feet is a good proportional measure for it. The hands at shoulder height, the hips are level, or maybe the front hip's a little lower than the rear hip. That keeps us not leaning back. It keeps us able to move both directions easily. Curved blade is going to put the point somewhere between the opponent's chest and low ribs, depending on how much curve there is in that blade. So this is kind of our starting point of where we're at, where we're making our cuts from. I think we also need to talk very briefly about how we grip the weapon. Here are 2 examples that I own. One of them is an antique Radielli saber, probably from the late 19th century, probably no later than maybe 1910-ish. I've got a modern fencing blade on it right now, but I've also got a sharp blade, a very light, very late sharp blade, probably, again, I'd assume no later than 1915. The other saber is an 1873 cavalry officer's saber. Both of these have grips that aren't quite as big as the monstrous grip on the 1871 cavalry trooper sabers. The grip that we're seeing here is that we've got the thumb on the back strap. The saber grip is carried more out in the fingers, out in here. On a really big gripped saber like an 1871, frankly, when I pick one of those up, I feel like a kid trying to wear his dad's suit jacket. It's just this monstrous grip. It doesn't fit my hand particularly well. But when I do hold it, it does tend to lay a bit more across the palm simply because it's so big. Sometimes we see the thumb will drift a little bit off to the corner of the back strap. We see that in Barbasetti's book. It's something I do quite a lot myself. It's fine. And the reason I'm making a big kind of point of talking about this is because we're going to see in some of the supplementary documents, Mazziello talks about really trying to get the grip under the hypothenar eminence of the hand. That's great, but on these smaller grips, it doesn't really work as well. You end up kind of holding it very weakly out on the middle of the palm, and it's not a very good grip. Bigger grips work better for that. But regardless, the point I'm going to make with it is that there is a difference because of the way we hold it in the fingers or even across the palm. There's still a little difference in alignment between the length of the forearm and the angle of the blade, and that's going to be important later. It's a small point, but I think it's an important one, and we'll get there. So having set the stage for that, I think the first thing we need to do is really define our types of cuts. Essentially, we have Molinelli, which are circular cuts. They're based on the elbow as technically as the center point of movement, the pivot point, so to speak. We can divide those Molinelli into practice Molinelli, into combat Molinelli, including the Ristretti Molinelli, which in the Italian books, they just say, make a very narrow Molinello. Excuse me. We'll get there here in a bit, and we'll go through defining what those are. The chambered cuts or coupes in the early material really don't distinguish between the coupe and the direct cut. Del Frate tells us that any cut that isn't made with the entire circle of the Molinello is a coupe. That's true to an extent, Later authors like Masiello, Rossi, they break the direct cuts out, and it just makes a little bit more sense organizationally. And a fun little quote from Del Frate is pointing out that the cut needs to be so strong, so decisive, and with the edge, that where it touches either kills the opponent or puts him out of combat. So we're defining very early in the system what the quality of the cut should be, what its purpose is. If we get to it later, we'll start to talk about when the cut became a wounding action by definition. But initially setting the stage for early Radielli Sabre, that's where we're at with those actions. So to move on to the Molinelli in general, we can say that there are 6 Molinelli, according to Del Frate. Rossi and Masiello later defined the traversone as Molinelli. They're really a variant of the cut to the face. So the 6 that we've got are 2 to the head, 1 from each side, 2 to the face, again, 1 from each side, and then 1 from each side that rises very steeply and strikes either the abdomen or the flank. These Molinelli are elbow-based. Del Frate makes a big point in his book about how the complete practice of the cuts is included, as are the parries, in the 6 Molinelli. There are some exceptions to it. There's a little bit of hyperbole there, but for the whole, it's not an untrue statement. So when we start really talking about the practice Molinelli, what we're looking at are big cuts. They're a little bit exaggerated, and they're intended to be used as a training tool. And what we see here in image 1 is that the fencer has leaned forward. He's extended his rear leg. He's put his weight forward. His torso is in line with the rear leg. And this is what Del Frate calls the feint thrust position. There's a note in my errata in The Art of the Dueling Sabre where I've corrected that. I originally had misread it and rendered it as a point and line position based on the method that he was using to get into the position, but that was an error. It's a lean forward, not a step back. Regardless, what it does is it sets the initial movement, the initial starting point for the cut. In the second image, what we can see is that the fencer has executed the first movement of the Molinello. He's lowered the saber, depending on the size of the action, or he's raised it up and dropped the point and brought it back. As he leans back, the weight transfers to the rear. And then as he makes the cut, he's swinging the saber forward. He's following with the body. And then he ends up essentially in the same position from which he started. And that's true of all 6 of those cuts. They all finish up around the height, depending on the source, somewhere between the height of the shoulder and the height of the chin with the hand. And what we're doing here is we're teaching balance, strength, coordination. We're teaching the order of operation so that the hand isn't too soon or too late. And the rocking forward and backward gives us the ability to work lateral abdominals and such as well, because that's an important part of cutting and parrying on horseback. And especially the 1873 cavalry regulations implementation of Radielli goes into that in more detail, as does the book that I pulled these images from that you're seeing right now, which is Masiello's 1891 Sabre Fencing on Horseback. So what we're told about these Mulinelli essentially is that Radielli's real big contribution to Italian saber was not the light weapon that people talk about, but rather it was the reorganizing of the Mulinelli, taking them from a wrist-based action to an elbow-based action. The reason being, in part, that there was a Ministry of War regulation that said, gosh, your cuts, your Mulinelli cuts, should teach the cuts that the cavalry actually use. Well, the cavalry of the time, the Italian cavalry that is, used elbow-based chambered cuts that brought the saber up overhead. The wrist Mulinelli obviously don't teach that, and that was considered by Radielli to be problematic. So we reorganized the Mulinelli and we recreate them in a sense so that they actually teach those cuts. And that was their big push. Also, one of the reasons that they're big on reorganizing those Mulinelli is because Radielli and Del Frate had this feeling, this sense that the Mulinelli struck with more force from the elbow, that you had more reach because you could really lean in with it. You had better edge alignment because the length of your forearm is a nice guide from the elbow to the wrist if you're keeping the wrist straight and not bending it side to side out through the edge of the blade. And so that gives us the ability to know that wherever my elbow is pointing and wherever my wrist is pointing with the straight wrist, my blade is going to follow that. And so I am more likely, between that and how the wrist articulates, I'm more likely to land with the edge than with the flat on the elbow rather than on the wrist. Order of operations, we've kind of discussed a little bit already, but it's incredibly important. Let's take a look here real quick with the weight shifting Mulinelli. I'm just going to let this run through once. And you can see how the saber leads the action in all of these cuts. Let's see here. Okay. So, and the order of operations really is important. I've got a slide here. Here we go. If you get your order of operations out of whack, you can end up doing what I call doing a cavallati or being cavallati. So Cavallati was a sitting member of Italian Parliament, as was his opponent, Macola. And in 1898, they got themselves into a bit of a dust-up that resulted in a duel that was fought with sabers. And you'll note in the illustration that they're wearing the Radielli-style saber glove. That was a requirement in a lot of saber duels because it avoided a situation where somebody got a little cut on the hand that would keep them from continuing but didn't satisfy the severe wound. And so then you might be in a position where you have to heal up and come back and do this thing over. So a lot of the dueling codes had a requirement for this saber glove. And it really just takes the forearm off the table as target. But other target restrictions were forbidden. Anyway, to get back to my point, Cavallati and Macola have this duel. And Cavallati decides that he's going to scare or intimidate, or maybe he just makes a mistake. And he steps forward while raising the saber up overhead. And he ends up eating a stop thrust, quite literally. The blade enters in the gap between where his two front teeth were supposed to be. He didn't have his dentures in. And it enters his mouth and penetrates the carotid in the back of his neck. He loses consciousness, they say, within about 6 seconds and was dead within about 30 seconds. So every now and then in practice, well, I say in practice, in the before times when we had practice and we didn't have the Rona, I would yell at students, "Don't be Cavallati," when I'd see somebody stepping in and raising the hand. And it's a fun little reminder and a sad tale of a both fleeting and permanent mistake. So when we talk about the practice Molinelli, again, they're bigger, they're about technique, strength and balance, and about not being Cavallati. Moving on from the practice Molinelli to get into kind of the truly practical bits, we get into the practical bits here, and we can really start talking about the combat Molinelli on foot. They're smaller. We are going to use them either with a lunge or from immobility as a riposte. The Molinello Ristretto increases the amount of wrist mobility that you use, and it creates a tighter action. It's not as powerful, but it still needs to be driven, at least in the final, from the elbow. We'll go into a little bit more detail about that later, but essentially what you're doing is you're using a little bit of wrist added back into the action. It deforms the circle of the Molinello so that you come around the circle more quickly. And I've got a couple of videos here. I hope they queue up as nicely as the last one did. We've got a couple of videos here showing the different sizes. Here's a good illustration from Rossi, 1885. And you can see from it, he's got 3 arcs in this image. The biggest one is the full-size practice Molinello that includes quite a lot of shoulder along with the elbow. The second arc is the combat Molinello, and then of kind of a medium size. And then the third arc has a lot of wrist in it, but it's still driven from the elbow. I think this is a really good sort of visual aid here to give us some kind of idea of what we're doing. Okay, I've got these, maybe not in quite the order I wanted, but Flashing Steel is one of those videos that's been floating around the web for quite a number of years now. I've queued it up when they actually start fencing. The point that I'm hoping you'll see here, there's several Molinelli, they're good sized. There's also some chambered cuts that are also good sized. And we have to remember here, Leon Bertrand had a diploma from Accademia Nazionale. He was trained in what I'm guessing is probably the Mazziello derivative of Radielli and Sabre that became popular in Great Britain around 1890 or so, when Mazziello did a bunch of work in Italy. So let's go ahead and press play here. And you're going to see some chambered cuts. You're going to see a couple of big Molinelli. There's a big one, another one. So it's just a neat little clip. The rest of this goes on into the, well, now I've lost my cursor. There we go. The rest of the video goes into some more modern Sabre of the era. Now, this was shot in 26, and they were kind of fencing as they would have back in the day. But we can move on from here. Whoops, that was not what I wanted to do. Okay, so here's a look at the mid-sized Molinelli. Let's see if this works. Okay, so these are very much on the elbow. I'm just standing still. It's just a demo of the arm actions. Okay, so that kind of gives us a sense of what that mid-sized one is. Now let's hope my luck holds, and we'll see the small Molinelli. So these would be typically used as, well, that wasn't it. Here we go. These would typically be used, both of these, as what Del Frate would call a second intention attack. To give you a little context, if I make a thrust with a lunge that I intend to hit, that for Del Frate is a first intention attack. If I make a beat and a thrust or a beat and a cut, that's a second intention attack. If I make a beat, feint cut, he would call that a third intention attack. That's a little different than the sort of defensive second intention that we talk about more today. But to give you an idea of what's going on, that's kind of when we might use those, and we'll get there later. So here, just a little bit smaller, a little bit more wrist, but you can see I'm still getting the arm about, the forearm that is, about 90 degrees off of perpendicular to the line of direction. That makes sure that in the final action of the cut, even if it's small, it's still driven from the elbow. And that's really important for us. When we move on to the coupes, as I mentioned earlier, Del Frate says anything that's not a Mulinello is a coupe. We're going to chamber these up overhead, or we're going to make them from the Perry, because in Del Frate's original look at this, the Perry's all bent the arm. Since we're fully extended, if we take fifth, well, that bends the arm. If I take third, that bends the arm. Same with fourth. When we get into Mazziello's take on things, or Pecoraro and Pacina later, they're kind of insistent on keeping the arm extended in the Perry. I think a lot of that is pedagogical packaging, probably an attempt to avoid students from bending the arm too soon, or they're making the assumption that at the moment of impact, we immediately start the Mulinello or coupe action of the riposte. And I think we're going to see a little bit of that even in the video that I've got coming up of Italo Santelli and Attila Petschauer. So it's a famous quote from Del Frate here that these cuts are made like the blow of a hammer. And there's some complaining in the commission's report in Parise's book about how Radiellian fencers hit too hard. So yeah, that's true, probably to an extent, but we'll talk later. There are some courtesies that you can afford your opponent, your training partner, so you don't break them, that really don't hurt anything, and especially don't hurt the opponent. So one of the things that they did back in the day, instead of bashing on each other with these great big cuts, they would teach the cuts by using the sforzo, which are powerful sliding beats that run down the blade. They either displace the blade or sometimes they disarm people. In fact, you're going to see one of these with the student where I'm left with about 2 fingers on the weapon grip. Right there, as I'm pointing out to John Epler that I've got about 2 fingers left on it. And a miss, and then another success. So these simple sforzi in third and in fourth were used to train the cutting. That way you're hitting the blades, you're not hitting each other, especially with cavalrymen, where in the regiment they didn't have a lot of fencing equipment, it sounds like. This was a good substitute. It avoided hurting people. It avoided developing flinch responses. It also taught you how to undergo impact to your weapon and not lose it. So another thing that happens that's just a fun little linguistic thing in these old Italian books, as unification occurred, there was a great deal of, I'd almost call it francophobia, where in the fencing books especially, there was a big push to make sure that we had good Italian terms for everything. And coupe wasn't popular with the establishment. So to the extent that they even referred to it, a lot of times the Italian books that were not from the North would call it cavazione angolata, or an angular disengage. And it's just one of those fun little notes. So these are the big chambered cuts. We can move on to the direct cuts. These take the absolute shortest path to the target, and a lot of other systems make more use of them than we do because they're starting perhaps from a third guard position where the arm is really bent. Parise, for example, even though he says to use guard of second, he illustrates everything in his book from guard of third. So one of the things that happens is when you start from that low guard of third with the elbow almost against the hip, you've got a lot more extension left, and you can make more useful cuts from that position. Although I don't love them, and I think that guard has some serious problems with it regarding measure and a sort of false sense of security. Barbasetti, we'll see it in the video of Santelli, and we're going to see it in a couple of other books where their direct cuts, quote unquote, I don't think are really direct because they're still having you chamber it a little bit. It's just a bit of a squishy definition. So for us, we're going to use the true extending direct cuts in Radielli and Sabre almost exclusively as a riposte, because they're really the only time that they work for us is when we've made a parry, because that parry bends the arm, and now we're in a position to just swing the arm forward, extend the arm forward to actually land a cut. Otherwise, really what we're doing, we might call it a direct cut, but really what we're doing is chambering just a little bit when we're in that guard of second or guard of third. Otherwise, a direct cut with a lunge just doesn't have any power behind it whatsoever. Another part that I think gets missed at times when we chamber that direct cut or that coupe, we're creating, because it's from the elbow, we're creating a void where our forearm used to be. So yes, we're extending the arm out there on guard, but if someone starts cutting for the arm, when we chamber that time cut, we can just let their blade fall past and on we go. So it does create a bit of a void for us. Okay, here is the pet shower video. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen this, but I just wanted to make sure everyone had seen it. This got uploaded on YouTube, last week sometime, I think. I've queued it up to start with the start of a lesson, and I'm going to turn the sound on for this one just because it's interesting. So where I've paused this video here, you'll note he's just started the lunge, but right before he starts the lunge, he actually is chambering the cut just a little bit to give it some power. And you'll note that this is in 1930. We're using at this point the pre-S2000 modern Sabre blade. It's a 6 to 8 millimeter blade, and those would have been in use for at least 10, if not 15 years by then. But Italo Santelli is still having his students chamber that cut. So let's just let this play out a little. And in here, there's, I think, a couple of Molinelli that are almost so fast that the camera can't catch them. I would definitely suggest spending some time with this video after the lecture. Take a look at it, pick it apart, see what they're doing. Note also here how Pet Shower is sinking into his parries. He's lowering his hips, lowering his center of gravity with the parries. That makes the little bit of leaning back and forth that he's doing. Certainly, it imbalances him less, and it makes him much more stable. Oh, here's also a fun little note. We're going to see one more example of this. The inquartada that we see in Castello's book, in Pecoraro and Piscina, where both feet come off the line, here's an example of that. Okay, I think we've seen kind of what we need to see from here. I think it illustrates the cutting mechanics. We're still putting power into it. We're cutting into the target. That's important. And we're going to move on here, and I can talk about that a little bit more. Oh, well, I guess our luck had to run out here sooner or later. Let me see if I can get this to behave. Okay, no go. I'm going to skip this one. It's not all that important. So to follow into cutting mechanics, keeping in mind what we just saw in my Milanello videos, in that Santelli video, cutting mechanics inherently are implied in Del Frate's writing. He tells us, that we start from an extended arm, we finish with an extended arm. It's starting at chin height or shoulder height. It's finishing there in all of the cuts. And that's a good sort of fencing on foot perspective. Mazziello writes a great deal more about this in Sabre Fencing on Horseback and his 1893 and 1902, I believe, maybe 04. I think it's 02 though. Second and third editions of Sabre Fencing, which there is no true first edition to Sabre Fencing, quote unquote. That was the 1887 that combined saber and foil, and then in the second and third editions they broke those out. So we know from Del Frate that, and frankly other sources of the period, that cuts do the most damage when they hit with the center of percussion. In one of the items that I shared to chat, I mentioned how you find that. But essentially, if you let a saber hang by the knuckle bow from a finger, smack the blade on the side, if you look down into the final third of the blade, there's going to be a spot that doesn't appear to be oscillating, and there's the center of percussion. It's not going to work real well if you try to do that with an S2000 blade, because the construction of those blades pretty much puts the center of percussion wherever the Y section or Fullard section ends. There's just not enough there for it to really move that point out any farther. The cut, according to Mazziello, needs to strike the target square. And this is where I kind of get into the issue about how we're holding the saber. You'll recall in the Flashing Steel video, that one really overhead cut, he's cutting down and he's very much got the blade already square. That's certainly one way to look at it. I prefer to bring the pommel forward and really snap the fingers towards the end of the cut and try to get a little bit more power into it. Regardless, the angular difference between the grip and the forearm gives us a slight difference inherently in the angle of impact on the target versus the direction of travel. If next time you get a chance when you're cooking dinner, if you've got to split an onion and cut it, try a couple of cuts once, holding the knife very much level with the surface of the onion, push straight down. Try it again, dropping the point. Try it again, dropping the tail end, the back end of the knife. And you're going to find that both of those cut without any sliding movement at all, much better than simply holding the edge square and pushing it down. And I think the same thing is happening, and I've certainly noticed it on bamboo cutting in the past for test cutting. That makes a big difference because it's a tiny little bit of a slice, but it's without making an affected sort of reaching out and pulling back sort of action. Mazziello tells us that we should have none of that at all, and that to do so is to ruin the effect of the cut. The point that he's making is made more clear in the next slide for a lot of reasons here. On horseback, one of the first things we have to do with any cut is we absolutely positively have to avoid hitting our own horse. The ride ends real quick, I hear, and then you probably get trampled by the next rank behind you. Not something that you really want to have as the high point of your day, I suspect. So part of avoiding the horse is the default high first and high seventh positions and the associated Milanelli because of them. And that's why we see parry of first is taken way up here, because I've got a 35 or so inch saber blade. If I have to parry on my left side, I've got to get that blade across the horse without getting it bound up. I may also have to reach out in front to defend the horse's head. So we've got to clear the head. We've got to clear the front shoulders. We've got to clear the rear of the horse. And so all of those parries, well, first and seventh especially, are taken high for that reason. And that just kind of filters down into the use on foot. Later on, we'll start to see people take first a little bit lower. And that kind of is what it is. I didn't learn it that way, but it certainly exists in the system. Another problem with the pulling action is that, especially when we're on horseback, the only distance adjustments that you have without moving the horse are the lean of the torso. Jacopo Gelli comments in one of his pamphlets, and he was a cavalry officer once upon a time, in addition to being a fencing historian and just incredibly prolific writer. He comments that Parise's saber method forbid the leaning, and that if you can't lean into that cut, all you have is arm power, which may not be sufficient, and you may very well not reach given the distance between the riders. And it's, I think, worth pointing out that Parise's saber method, although it was adopted and made official in 1884, was rejected something like 4 or 5 times by the Italian cavalry, who simply refused to adopt it. And then eventually, over time, at Parise's school, because all of his staff were Radielli students, they essentially continued to teach Radielli and saber with sort of tacit approval and a little bit of lip service to the supposed official method. Anyway, these cuts on horseback also finish down at the height of the hip when we're making the descending cuts instead of stopping them at chin height. Again, they're bigger cuts, and they kind of match the need to the context. So when we start looking at it on foot, well, let me back up here. On horseback, the other problem with that sliding action is, again, that the follow through of such a cut is likely to come through at some point and hit the horse. Jelly also comments about the wrist Molinelli in that respect, with that common practice of holding the arm extended and rotating the saber around the wrist. That lower part of the rotation is very likely to cause problems by striking the horse in front or rear, unless you're entirely out to your right side. So that's another problem that they saw with this, and so that's why they were really big on the elbow based cuts in addition to the power. On foot, to catch up with my slides here, pulling that cut backwards toward yourself works essentially counter to the forward movement that you're making with the lunge. Ideally, you should strike the target just before your front foot hits the ground in the lunge. And from that point of impact, the knee settles forward. And that really is the true range of when you are on time, in tempo, to sort of acceptably late. But we see a lot of video these days of people striking where they've hit the ground with the front foot, the knee has rocked in, and now the saber comes screaming through, and that's really too late. Barbasetti actually, in his own copy of Del Frate's work, which was the textbook when he was in the first couple of years of the Fencing Masters program, he makes the comment in a handwritten note that the cut should strike just before the front foot lands in the lunge. And there's a couple of these versions of that book floating around that are in different people's hands, different students. And I think they're all were copying from some kind of a master list, because a lot of the comments all seem to be very much the same in those. But regardless, hit just before the front foot lands in the lunge, and you need to do so when the arm is just shy of the full extension arc, whether it's a descending cut or whether it's an extending riposte where somebody's backed up and you're making a lunge. Regardless, you need to hit the target, actually impact on the target just shy of full extension, so that you've got a couple of inches of forward travel into the target with the edge. That way, any sort of sliding or slicing that happens in the target happens on the finishing withdrawal arc, rather than being something that we've affected by reaching out and pulling the arm back. That's really problematic. It's also a great way for students to get cute, reach out, pull back, and miss. My late master absolutely exploded anytime he caught sight of any sort of a pulling movement that wasn't forward and across the target, because it was tantamount to trying to miss as far as he was concerned. And mostly he's right. So that's kind of where we're at as far as those mechanics on foot. We can do things like, at the moment of impact, we can relax our fingers. We fire and then immediately relax, let the saber blade bounce on the target. That's a lovely courtesy to your opponent or your training partner, so that you're not actually discharging all of the energy into their target. Otherwise, and I have students occasionally make those full power cuts and bring them all the way through. Any of that sliding essentially happens because either you're bending the saber blade or you're moving the target, rather than that you're sliding it across the surface. Maybe that's okay later for a wounding action. I still think it's a bad idea from from a right-of-way perspective for the sport that we'll talk about in a bit. And I think it's definitely a bad idea from the point of view that it, in many cases, teaches you to contract too early, and then you just start missing. So, well, actually, I've got it on my notes to talk about it here. So essentially, from a sporting perspective, any cut that reaches out past the target and then taps and pulls runs a really high risk of the referee simply missing the point and looking at it as a cut that missed and then a remise that's laid on after, or worse, when people get cute and they try to run a point thrust, what looks like a point thrust past the target, and then turn the hand and pull. That again, a good referee is probably going to look at that and go, oh, that's a miss and a remise, not an intentional cut that would have done, you know, much damage, would have had much quality to it. So you have to be very careful with things like that. False edge cuts, on the other hand, are probably going to be more easily seen by directors, but you're going to want to start those with the point wide so that they can see the sweep of the cut, or you need to have some blade contact, like a parry third, drop the point, and, you know, rip upwards under the wrist. There's not much denying what happened there. So it's harder for him to get that wrong. And I can totally see where people might say, well, you want that big sweep across the target to show the director. Okay, great, but let's do that forward into the target rather than pulling it backwards towards ourselves. So the tactical applications of cuts, what, when, where, and why. So big Molinelli are, yeah, technically we can do them as a simple direct attack. It's a bit risky. They're big. They provide tempo. Now, at the same time, they also, in the first part of the Molinello, in that chambering movement, if we're starting from the opponent's engagement or against their attempted engagement, then that's relatively safe. What we don't really want to do is just kind of start from a standstill where there's no blade contact and go, okay, I'm just going to make this great big Molinello, because you might very well eat a point. On the other hand, if you make that big Molinello as a riposte or as a final action after some kind of action on the blade, a beat, a transport, a change of engagement, or use it in tempo against your opponent's engagement, those are all much safer times to use that cut. And we're almost always going to cut deep target with the big Molinelli rather than make that great big action and try to pop them on the wrist. We'll save that for Ristretto Molinelli. Which, moving on to those, they're more widely applicable. We can use them in a lot more circumstances. We can use them as ripostes. We can use them in the same situations that we would normally use, that I just talked about, where we would use a bigger Molinello. As our blades get lighter and faster, these become dramatically more important, because they are inherently faster, and they give us the opportunity to kind of make a lot of stop cuts, keep the opponent from really forming a good idea of what they want to do. We can break up attacks with them. And that's really where these things really shine. The chambered cuts and coupes, well, there, I was rereading Del Frate's 1868 earlier, and I noticed a comment in there where he says that the coupe is perhaps almost always the single intention attack of choice for a cut. I'm sorry, the first intention attack of choice for a cut. Most of the time now, looking at Del Frate, we're going to say that any cut that's not a full circle of Molinello is a coupe. Okay, true. But most of the time, the coupe is going to be targeting the head, passing over the opposing blade. That is absolutely the case from a definitional standpoint by the time we hit Mazziello and Rossi and Pecoraro and Pacina. They're really narrowing that down. And so that becomes the coupe, and everything else is a direct cut. As far as their sort of definitional structures are used. These are great for use in tempo. They're great from the opponent's engagement. If your opponent won't do anything and you've got the engagement, sometimes they're a pretty good choice there, although honestly, a thrust by glide would be your better choice. And that's what I would always tell my students to do, is don't cut there. Just make a thrust by glide or make a feint thrust. Get them to move, get them to give you some tempo so that you can make a really good cut rather than doing something risky. But these direct cuts or these chambered cuts, great final actions. They do create a void, as I mentioned earlier. My arm's out here. They reach for my arm. Oops, you missed. Now I hit you. So we have to keep that in mind. They're great for stop cuts. Direct cuts, the true direct cuts, just extending forward, or the little bitty small chambered cuts that we see from Santelli. Obviously, they're using those with S2 or not S2000 blades, but the precursors. They're using them as direct attacks. I think for a more true to form early Radielli, we're going to use the true direct cuts only as ripostes, feint ripostes. Yes, they can do real damage, but they've got to be delivered properly. They just don't have the inherent power that some of the other cuts do. But they absolutely have a place, and they're very, very useful. As I was telling Patrick, I built this slideshow, and I had this great idea, and I really wanted this cut to the head from Mazziello. I guess maybe it does illustrate the center of percussion, but otherwise I have no idea exactly why I wanted this here. But here it is, and it's a great picture, so let's just enjoy that for a second, and I'm going to move on. Targeting is really kind of our final major topic here. Targeting on foot in fencing school play, and as we see in the 1910 rules that I just translated, fencing school play, the body from the hips up was target. In fencing on the ground, which fencing on the ground is it's essentially the Italian version of epee, spada, targeting rules. It's the full body. It was used for for spada and for sabre in Italy. The full body was target. It's kind of thinly coded language for fencing as if you were training for a duel. The typical rule set on that is that double touches count against both parties. They're usually 1 or 2 touch bouts. Doubles in a 2-touch, if you double out 2-2, you're both defeated. That was kind of the way things were done to be a little bit more serious. And I think what it also helped do, it was educational for the fencers because it showed just how much of a role chance had to play in the outcome of those very low touch bouts. Now, I will point out that, well, later I'll talk about targeting the lower body and why that really wasn't a thing for Italians, even though the rules allowed it, it was recommended against. In the duels, we saw the Cavallati image earlier. In a duel, very often that saber glove was required. And that is the source, and I've had several people in the last couple of years message me, even one just last week, saying, what's Barbasetti talking about with cuts to the hand are useless in real combat, but they also impede the defense? Well, what he's getting at is, for him, real combat means the duel at the time. And with that great big saber glove, you absolutely probably do not want to waste a perfectly good tempo whacking at someone's well-protected hand and wasting that tempo that you could be doing something else. You could be making a thrust, you could be making a cut to the head or to the body. But if you go wasting that tempo there, you increase your odds of getting hit with something that you really don't want to get hit with. You come slamming in on the arm, it doesn't do anything, and they stick the point through your chest. And, at that point, you've realized you've made a horrible error. So that's kind of the context there, in case anybody ever asks, gosh, what's Barbacetti going on about? Well, that's it. On horseback, our primary targets are the head, the face, and the rein hand. Earlier on, the Italian cavalry saber treatments do include some cuts to the horse, thrust or two to the horse. There are some problems with this because anytime you're cutting down to the opponent's horse, there's one cut that has the blade trailing behind you. It's a passing cut, and it runs essentially from the horse's front shoulder over the rider's leg and down off the horse's rear leg. Well, that's a long time that your hand is low and not up to protect you and your horse. So while you're trying this cut, you may be eating steel. Also, the reason of this restricted target is that there is some protection from the uniform jacket, but even more so the rolled up cape or great cloak. And here's the cover of Sabre Fencing on Horseback, and you can see over the rider's right shoulder, he's got the rolled up cloak or cape. And here's a couple other nicer photos or nicer images that I've found that show the same thing. So you'll get students once in a while that say, well, why don't we cut the neck, or why don't we cut the body on horseback? Well, you've got this great big wool cloak all rolled up over the shoulder. That's going to provide some protection both to that mandritto chest cut and to that reverso cut to the side of the neck. So you were better to cut down on the head, cut the rein hand, that kind of thing, or thrust to the body. So you've all borne through this with me so far. I know somebody's probably going to ask, so I wanted to get out in front of it. This is the common HEMA problem. Everybody wants to, reach down to the leg. Yeah, it's fine. It's okay. Italian saber on the ground and dueling rules absolutely allowed the full body as target. But the books that actually talk about it, Parise talks about it, Pecoraro and Pacina talk about it in their fencing on the ground sections. And I should mention, Pecoraro and Pacina fully essentially reinstated Radielli's saber method as the official method when they took the school over after Parise passed away in 1910. They basically say, look, yeah, you can do this, but when you do it, you are reaching way forward to something of a low value target, and you're really exposing your head and torso. If you absolutely have to do it, I think the best way to do these actions is to do them with a rising cut, so that your hand at the end of it finishes up around your shoulder and you're quick to parry. If we do these as a descending cut, then our hand is low and we're not in much position to defend ourselves afterward. Another issue with it is, unlike most of the other schools that we see out in the world, or whatever HEMA thing somebody's cobbled together from a 12-page pamphlet that they've read once and practiced the moves a couple of times before starting to bout, One of the real problems with this is that Radielli's guard keeps that point forward. The curve of the blade puts the point somewhere between, the shoulder and the lower ribs when you're on guard, even to flank height. That's a severe deterrent to thinking that it's a good idea to go reaching for somebody's leg. So here's the Del Frate image. We can see engagement in second. We can see from invitation in second. I don't really have a great deal of desire to go reaching for the thigh or the leg if I don't have to, because I may very well find myself running on to a point to do it. From a pure defensive standpoint, we don't talk about, in most of these books, we don't talk about defense of the leg. I think because it's really not necessary, but common fencing lessons, even in a modern classical sport context with my late master, he would have us parry low cuts now and then. He'd have us parry late counterattacks. All of these things are in the system. We can absolutely do them if we want to. If we have a student that's going out to some tournament where that's going to be a thing in the rules, and knowing that people like these sorts of things, then we need to spend more time on it in lessons. We need to have people take parries first and second lower to defend the leg. We maybe need to have them take third and fourth low, especially with Del Frate's half cross step back. That voids the leg really, really well. And frankly, if somebody reaches out to take the leg like that, and you then lunge in your riposte and give it some power on that cross step forward into a lunge, you're probably going to dissuade them from working that leg very much in the future, especially if you really zing it in there and just don't pull the cut. Stop cuts with a half cross step to the rear work really well. To get it out there, Rassemblement or Riunita also works. I don't like that action because it brings you into a standing position. It brings your feet together. If somebody's smart, a canny fencer may feint that cut to the leg to try to draw that reassemblement position and then finish with a cut to the head, or better, especially if they're being rude, a thrust to the face, because that makes a big impression. So those are some things that we kind of want to just keep in mind if we're going to have students going out into that bigger world and playing with the leg shot people. So I think that really covers the issue perfectly well. The same thing with late counterattacks and the completely ahistorical afterblow nonsense, because they're trying to import German longsword into 19th century Sabre. It was not uncommon at all growing up to make an attack parry riposte, counter riposte in a lunge, and then be required to recover from the lunge and make one or two parry ripostes additionally of late counterattacks. And that was just kind of a common thing. It's good for the hand. It's good medicine for the hand. It's good for keeping students paying attention and not kind of finishing an action and then just kind of slumping into it and kind of falling out of focus. So these things have never really disappeared from the curriculum. They've always kind of been around, but we just haven't emphasized them perhaps as much as we should from the point of view of modern HEMA tournament rule sets. So here's, yeah.
We're just at a little over an hour, so
okay.
I just want to make sure that we also have time for questions, right?
Okay, yeah, I am just about out of slides too. I've got a couple of videos, cutting videos, and this little comment here. Here's the third and fourth low for anybody that's not familiar with it. It's a half cross step back with it, and it really voids that leg. But it avoids, in the same token, it avoids you standing up and risking that lean backwards. It avoids taking you out of the fencing action. And so I think this is a much better way to go about defending the leg. Okay, so just a little bit of a preface here. The saber that I'm using is an antique Radielli saber. I thought I was buying a sporting blade, a fencing blade, in the pair of sabers that I won in an auction on Italian eBay. And I didn't realize it was a sharp until I reached into the shipping container and just about cut myself. So it was an unlooked for little bit of fun there. This is a 15 millimeter FW Holler blade. It is probably 1900, 1915 at the latest, because these were kind of going out of fashion by then. And given that it's a sharp, I'm guessing, somewhere around there, could be as early as 1880s. So the bamboo that I'm cutting is about an inch in diameter. I think I could cut heavier, thicker, but the blade's not in great shape, and I have no desire to risk it for ego. So and these are just nice, easy, light cuts. Okay, here I think I get a lunge on this one. But again, it cuts really, really well. You don't hardly feel it go through. This is a little lighter bamboo too, but and then Josh, who did the session for Patrick here recently on equipment. Whoops. Let's see if I can get this to load properly. Previous. Next. Previous. Next. Okay, well, this one's not going to behave. I will skip the cutting with the 1855. That's going to finish out the slideshow presentation. I think we've got some time for Q&A now. I'm going to log the other laptop out. And how do I do this? Stop presenting. Okay, now I can see everybody again.
Can you see the chat, Chris?
Yes, I can.
I think the first question is from Tim. And then I'll just let you look through the chats, okay?
Sure. So for us, the distinction between the coupe and the direct cut is really, it's kind of a matter of scale as much as anything. The direct cut, I think as we define it today, is purely extension. It only goes forward. It's not a sort of deal where we're going to cock the arm and now cut. I think that's really still in the coupe range rather than a truly direct cut. That's where I draw the line. Others vary on that, but what we don't do is pull the arm back and hunch the shoulder up. Everything is really still manipulated from the elbow as a point of rotation. And Bob had asked about the interplay between the thrust and cut. So the long and short of it is, I think anytime you can make a thrust or a feint thrust, a feint by glide especially, anytime you have that opportunity to start from an engagement, you probably should. You should either force your opponent to reach for your blade to give you a tempo, or you should create the tempo with some kind of action on the blade, whether it's a glide, a feint by glide, or something else. But as Delfrate tells us, the absolute best of these actions are essentially anytime you can get the blade, you can keep the blade, you know where it's at. So if you can glide or feint by glide, you should always prefer to do that. Regarding targeting, Roy, essentially what we're always looking at is we're looking at descending cuts to the head that either come down directly on top of the head, or more often ever so slightly to one side or the other. The angle that you come through is very, very steep in any case, but it does help you somewhat close the line into which you're cutting with the guard. Face cuts are going to target the cheek, and they're going to hit ever so slightly rising most of the time. That's sort of the canon look at it. Later on, especially, we're going to see a little bit more descending cuts to the cheek. Excuse me, you're also going to see those in cavalry use, where the verticals and the diagonals kind of get blended together for the face. And that kind of sets the tone there. We don't really do horizontal cuts to the stomach. Those should be very steeply rising, and to the abdomen. Later on, you'll start to see some of that are a little bit more horizontal. The traversone, depending on where you learn them, are either diagonal starting on the shoulder and down, or they're treated a little bit more horizontally. And that covers the chest. As a left-hander, I will tell you that I spent a lot of time growing up cutting to the opponent's flank, and those were a descending cut most of the time. And when you do those, I always try to get students to think about actually cutting deep in the flank between the ribs and the hip, so that we're getting into soft, squishy stuff instead of skating on the rib cage. Rising to the abdomen, very, very steep. That cut is very difficult because you have to arch your back a lot to help the elbow and to help the shoulder articulate and to really get things moving steeply upwards. That's why in, if anybody's seen the Lesac Caroli book that Russ Mitchell translated and published recently, there's two versions of parry four. There's four and fourth low, and there's two versions of fourth low. One of them is horizontal across your crotch to avoid, they say it's about avoiding thrust, but the fact of the matter is that's to avoid that upwards abdomen cut skating across your crotch. So that's kind of our basic targeting. Arm is going to mirror essentially the body targets, because it's really just kind of a smaller target that sticks out there and you can cut it from any direction you like. Question about parry of seventh. Parry of seventh is really, really important when the opponent makes a direct cut riposte to your cheek after their own parry of fourth, assuming you're both the same hand. That's perhaps the absolute best time to use that parry. You can absolutely set up situations to use second intention there. For example, maybe we reach in and we cut inside to the top of the opponent's saber guard because we want to trigger their riposte after parry of fourth, because we know it's going to come to the cheek or even to the head on an angle. So we reach in, cut, and immediately we can roll into seventh. And if the thing to remember with first and with seventh is that we really need to be very careful to take those parries out in front of us. We want to be about 45 degrees off the line of direction, whether it's first or whether it's seventh. We don't want to, we see in the illustrations in Del Frate and in other books, we see this kind of like they're hanging here business. That's not where you want to intercept the blade. That's a great way to lose the outside of your arm. You want to catch the blade 45 degrees forward and across the line. We want to really tuck. I'll try to square up here just a little to the camera. You want to tuck the arm across so that you're looking out this little triangle created by the blade. And we want to catch it very forward, and we want to yield to it. And now as I get ready to riposte, I can open the elbow, open that shoulder, and make my cut. And the same thing is really true in first as well. It's just a little less cramped. We still want to catch it over here. It's forward. We can yield to the pressure if the cut's really heavy. Same thing's true over here. And if they're really pressing, we can open here to cut. So that's really where 7th is most useful. Yes, there are other times you'll see it in the synoptic tables. There are other places and times we can use it, but that's probably the absolute best one. False edge cuts, Patrick, I really think they come in more later. It's probably more of the Hungarian influence in the system. Yes, the false edge was sharp. I don't think I've seen any real note of cutting with the false edge in any of the core Italian texts, but certainly coming out of Santelli's tradition, I certainly learned some of them. And ideally, we're going to start those a little bit wide so that we've got some kind of power behind them. And they tend to pull by their nature. Reaching out and cutting across with the false is really kind of inconvenient versus cutting with the true edge. I can probably dig up some video. I think Patrick and I did some, and I can send it to you. But there really aren't a whole lot going on with those cuts. It's just that you're reaching out and you're sweeping, and you're going to pull with the index finger on that cut, and it's got to come back to you. Otherwise, you really don't have a whole lot. Often you may want to make that cut on the recovery to guard. Say you've parried in the lunge and you want to get back to guard and you want to make a riposte. Well, that's a great time to make that little cut with the false edge as you recover. Michael, I don't have a satisfactory answer for you. Yeah, there's definitely some similarities to that really narrow guard. I don't know whether somebody was enterprising and said, hey, I'm tired of getting my hand hit. What can we do? Took it to the armor and said, oh, hey, let's add a ring to it. I have seen some fencing sabers. There's one in Maestro Turan's collection in the museum in Busto Arsizio that is basically built on like an 1834 cavalry saber hilt or 1860. And on the inside of it, they have come in and they've added a flat stock bar that takes the same place as the inside of the ring does on a Radielli. Where it came from, I'm really not sure. There's been a lot of variations of it, and we see a lot of these still kind of turn up now and then with the ring having been removed. We'll see them every now and then on auctions where there's two holes where probably that ring was popped off when the rules changed. I've seen a video recently was uploaded at the same time as the pet shower video, or maybe a couple of weeks before, and it's from like 1940, and one of the fencers is using a Radielli hilt. So they stayed in use for an awfully long time, and it makes it really hard to guess sometimes as to how old some of these people are, and so on. So I wish I had a better answer for you, but that's all I've got. Ron, the 8 cuts, essentially some of the later authors, Mazziello, Rossi, they include either diagonal or theoretically horizontal cuts to the chest and to the back. that are made as a variant of the face cut. And those are the other 2 cuts that make up the 8. Okay, Sforzo di Cambiamento. I thought perhaps somebody might ask about this one. This one's a hard one. Let me give you kind of I think the simplest one to talk about is in first, because what's happening here is that where your blades meet, you are going from a true edge to true edge meeting, and you are pivoting against the opponent's blade up the other side. And so you go from true edge to essentially kind of false edge to false edge. That's kind of the oversimplified way to explain it. And so once you are there, the elbow drops, and now I'm using the spine of my blade, and I'm extending out and across. I think the book tells you that it's like in fourth. I've always taken that as hand position of third, or invitation position of third, but with a hand in fourth, because you get a better ramp and you get a better true edge cut off of it. Fifth and sixth are essentially the same. It's just that you've met the blade up here over your head, and you're going to turn here. It doesn't come all the way. I think these are just kind of, they're helpful sort of descriptors, but we're not going to come all the way over here and then down. We're going to turn kind of in place underneath and just slide away and just expel them from there. Now, when we look at Rossi, for example, he's going to take fifth, and he will tell you that it's essentially he changes the Sforzo di Cambiamento into a true edge beat. And so he'll take this engagement, or the parry here, blades resting on it, he's going to turn and come around and beat it across. And that's a very different action, I think. So sixth, catches the blade, turns in place, comes down, expels it with the spine. It's just a turn under. And frankly, I think that's a good way to sort of visualize it. But you can also try it leaning back out of distance, have somebody cut into the head, and just bring the saber up, and don't actually take the parry, just turn, and then help them on their way down with the expulsion, with the Sforzo. And if you play with that a little bit, I think you'll find that that works pretty well, and can also be another way to get a sense for it. But really, once you get the feel of this one, I think this is the easiest one to do. And you have to be just very nonchalant, very gentle with it. It's just catch the blade, roll the hand, flip the arm. As soon as you get a sense of that, the rest of them will kind of fall into line. Also, third to fourth and fourth to third, those are good for that as well. You know, you catch a parry in fourth, you slide up their blade, bending the elbow, slide up their blade until you run out, and as soon as you're across, just flip it away. As far as fencing sabers go, honestly, I think the best thing on the market right now is, at least here in the US, is for us to combine a Hanwei so-called Pecoraro. It's really a Mazziello second model hilt. Pecoraro hilts don't have holes in them. Combine that hilt with a 16 or 20 millimeter blade from Castile. They will weigh and balance about what Radielli would want. The 16 weighs a little less, but it balances a little bit more forward. I really like how those turn out. Over the summer, Gvetun asked for help on designing a Radielli saber, and I sent them about 20 pages of specs, suggestions, photos, and I don't know where they're at on that. If they can get something onto the market that actually is right, I suspect that could be a really good thing as well. As far as rivals go, Ben, essentially the Radielli system was put into place in 68 by the Italian military, 1868 that is, by the Italian military, and it was promulgated through the mounted corps, which included cavalry and mounted artillery. They used it as a duty system, but of course it was also fenced in a civilian capacity. The Parise thing really is, I suppose you could call them a rival, but I'm not sure that his Sabre system really merits that much credit. You know, that was a very political decision that put Parise in charge. And he immediately hires Radielli's top young instructors, Pecoraro and Pessina, as his assistants. And they kind of pay lip service to the system. And meanwhile, a lot of the other people, Barbasetti goes to Vienna, Italo Santelli goes to Budapest, Santelli's brother, Orazio, ends up in Prague. Pini was Radiellian. He ends up in South America. It spreads like mad across Europe after Parise is appointed. A lot of people leave and go elsewhere. So it just spread that system everywhere. Levi, no, we really don't do a half circle simply because we do first instead. Can you make a parry there? Yeah, I suppose you can. You can absolutely make the sforzo of half circle as a strong disarmament. I find it a little bit awkward, but Del Frate really likes it. And so certainly you could do that. You might do it perhaps against somebody that wants to hit the leg, but I would much prefer to take first there. Excuse me, Jim. I honestly, I would say Caccia's system is definitely a precursor, and we see similarities between it and Radielli and Lambertini. I haven't seen the pre-Radielli cavalry regs. Maestro Turan just got a copy of those cavalry regs, I think from like 1860 or 65. So they would have been just before Radielli's method replaced it. What I can gather from Caccia is that, you know, we've got the chambered overhead cuts. He's got a little bit wider repertoire of stuff on horseback. Radielli's method really seems to narrow that down, and I think try to focus on the best and most useful actions. But I do think that it's probably a precursor system. So at this point, I think I've kind of hit the pre-canned questions here. Does anybody have anything else if you just kind of want to pipe up and chime in?
Please do. Don't be shy. I know many of you are working from Chris's books, and so oftentimes it's hard to learn from a book, right? So if you've got questions about how does this work, good time to spring those on Chris.
Yeah, no, that's perfectly fine by me. Anyone?
Well, Chris, Ben here. Why do we see so few attacks by glide from fourth?
Well, attack by glide from fourth is just one of those things that drops out of the method. I think because it is inherently a cavalry method, and we don't see that used in the cavalry context by Radielli's time, or at least not in Radielli's system. We don't really thrust by glide there. the thrust that normally would be across the body in fourth and pushing this way, they are replacing with turning in the saddle and really withdrawing and then making the thrust that direction with the hand in first and second. So it's one of those things that Parise actually allows the thrust in fourth following a parry in fourth. And that was the one exception that I had growing up as a high school age saber fencer with my maestro, is that occasionally he would say, oh, let's thrust in fourth following parry of fourth. I think another problem is a practical one from the point of view of keeping blades intact and working, and not bending them backwards, especially as things got later and you know, we got to lighter and lighter saber blades. We train that curve into the saber blade, and then we turn that over into fourth and we make a thrust. And well, sometimes it bends the direction that we've trained it to, and a lot of times we're forcing it the other direction. So that's more likely to badly bend or break a blade. So that would be kind of my take on that. Patrick, low third and fourth, take the step back. You're going to try to keep the front shoulder forward. You can twist in the hips if you need to. In the illustrations, it looks like, you know, he's kind of stepping off the line a little bit. It's not mentioned in the text. I think that's kind of up to you, what works for you. I think that's perfectly fine. You can also do low third and fourth with just a little step back, regular retreat, and just really drop the hand low inside or outside the knee. Oh gosh. Okay, Corey. The Barbasetti counter parries, they are the same thing as Del Frate's counter parries. They are just whittled down to kind of the two that were really kind of actually useful. So let's set the stage for that first. Where we use the counter parry, not the circular parry, which Radielli or Del Frate calls yielding, but the actual counter parry, we use that when we are really, really close to our opponent. So say you lunge and you end up too close to your opponent, and you've lunged, you've cut to the head, he's parried fifth, for example, and he's going to turn and make a Mulinello and cut you across the chest. Well, from there, you can absolutely bend the arm and take fourth or fourth low to solve that problem. But what you can't do, because you're going to wind up bound up on your opponent's body, you're going to catch the inside of his front leg probably. You can't really go from head cut to half circular fifth because maybe you're too close, or head cut to half circular first. Again, you may be too close to your opponent. You may end up in a position where for a brief moment, your blade gets stuck on the inside of the leg and you get hit. So what you are doing is, let's say that you made your initial cut was Mulinello to the head from the left and you cut. He's coming around and he's going to hit you back on your shoulder or more horizontally across the chest. What you are doing is I tell people you are hitting the rewind button just like you used to on that ancient piece of technology called the VCR. You hit the rewind button and you literally undo the Mulinello and then finish it in first. And the reason we're doing this is because we are really close to our opponent. We can't go this way because we're going to get hung up. So we rewind that Mulinello and finish it in first. The same thing is true in fifth. We're here and maybe I'm going to get stuck again here trying to come up to fifth. So instead I circle the other direction, and it's like a cut to as I pretend to be a right-hander and I try to pretend that I have a right-handed opponent. It's like a cut to your opponent's outside cheek. So we cut. He's going to untwist and make a Mulinello to my head here, and I'm going to beat him around the circle and take fifth. Now, you can see how this is possibly questionable. You've got to see it coming early. You've got to do it quickly. If you've got the chance, you may want to try to recover with that parry and buy some distance. That brings us into a Barbasetti question about whether it's better to parry in the lunge or whether it's better to recover. And I will always kind of argue that I disagree with him a little bit there, because if I can parry in the lunge, why am I recovering? Because now I make my riposte much slower and much later. I've made an unnecessary move that now delays my riposte. So not to get into that at the moment, but does that help on the counter parries? Bob, as far as next book, not sure. I've actually been playing with translating several of Jelly's longish essay pamphlets that really go into the political situation of the choice of Parise, how the Scuola Magistrale was run, some things like that. And that's probably going to be the next publication. The next big book, I really haven't decided. Derek, I don't have an answer for you. I don't do really anything outside of this Italian system. The Polish stuff has basically no interest to me. And I don't have an answer for you. So I'm glad you're enjoying it, Arian, but I don't think there's a question there. So I'll say thanks and move on. Ernesto, I have not in the mounted context. I've done the exercises on the ground with students. And you can get at least some of a sense of how it's supposed to work, and you can kind of move around and you can set up some multiple opponent drills and things like that. A couple of years ago, the Kenjutsu group that I've been in and out of for the last 20 years, we almost had a horse rental situation sorted out. And then, of course, as those are wont to do, it fell through at the very last moment. But I'm hoping in the future we might get the chance to do that. Ernesto, as far as the shoulder pieces go, I really don't know. I'm not sure what a lot of those were made of. And frankly, a lot of those were not worn as part of the combat uniform. They were part of the really big fancy dress uniform, but not necessarily something that was worn in the combat uniform. To the extent that they were, probably, they would have certainly done some work there to protect the target. Anyone else? Anything? Patrick?
While people are ruminating for a second, just to kind of echo what Chris has shared some of his initial translations of some of the Jelly and other pieces from Italian military journals. And I'll just kind of bloviate about this point for a second, because I think it's really interesting. One stumbling block we have, like as sort of Italian fencers, or really, it would be the same for French fencers, or somebody mentioned Polish fencing or whatever. People who do British fencing have an advantage because, most of us here are using English as a first language, not everybody. But there's a whole wealth of stories and things that we are aware of. People read, Hutton and Castle and Aylward and all this stuff. And so people who do British or English fencing, there's a whole bunch of ancestral stuff that we have, right? it's much more difficult if you're not a native Italian speaker, French speaker, whatever your tradition is. They have a lot of this, like the context of where the Sabre systems came from, the politics of Parise, because there's a whole bunch of kind of crazy stuff about why Parise's Sabre system gets picked out that is kind of glossed over in a lot of the histories. So what the stuff that Chris is working on right now, at least the snippets that he shared with me and a couple others, really interesting stuff that will give us a lot more of these sort of stories, the same way people who do British Sabre have stories about Hutton or Castle or Heaven to Betsy if you do silver or something like that, right? You know, you've got all this kind of stuff, right, where you can contextualize what you're doing. We don't always have as much of that in English about Italian Sabre. So what he's working on with Jelly and some other stuff would be pretty interesting. So anyways, just because Jelly himself was a real fascinating, very opinionated historian, cavalry officer, and so on. So, further questions for Chris? Now that I've bloviated a wee bit and gave you time to sort of ruminate on things.
Oh, and yeah, Corey just linked Sebastian's blog. You should definitely check it out. Where I focus mostly on the large books, the core tradition texts. Sebastian's done a lot of hunting down documents, tournament reports, some of the same interviews that I've been working on. He's got some of that stuff up. Excuse me. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there you should definitely take a look at. There's a really interesting article on historical fencing saber weights and the specs behind those based on fencing books and rule sets and things like that. And then, you know, I kind of look out across the vast plain of Hemaland and go, gosh, why are these people all wanting to fence with 900-gram cavalry trooper sabers on foot in full stiffness and think that that's a good idea? So
I think you have a question about the forearm protection from Tim, Chris.
Oh, well, in the Sabre duel, those Sabre gloves were required. And generally that's speaking to duels in Italy between Italians because that's what the code was. The fact of the matter is why it's really done is this. The typical pre-World War I, especially, dueling codes, and really even pre-1900, Parise's code 1897 is one of the first that speaks positively that I can think of about first blood as a standard for Italian saber duels or Italian sword duels for that matter. Prior to that, Rossi, Angelini, Lieutenant General Angelini, whose dueling code was very influential, Jelly, all of their codes basically held that a first blood duel was a mockery of a duel and was forbidden, as was restricting target area such that, you know, maybe they forbid a cut to the head or forbid a thrust to the chest as part of the standard. They hated that. And the argument essentially against that was that if you restrict a cut to the head or you restrict a thrust to the chest, then you may very well create murder where there was no intent for that. The prevailing standard for a duel in Italy in that 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s era was a severe wound from which one or more of the combatants cannot continue. And that was a medical decision made by the attending physicians. There's a reason for this because under Italian law at the time, dueling was not just a crime, it was a capital offense. And if you were involved in a duel, on the other hand, that was conducted according to one of the acknowledged, widely used dueling codes, then you went from potential execution down to, oh, you might get the absolute max of a year in jail. And really what you got was a slap on the wrist, and, you know, you greased the right palms, and the police showed up late and went, oh, we must have missed it. So the long story short, though, is that part of that severe wound standard was that you wanted to make sure that an actual severe wound was inflicted so that you could end this thing. If you didn't wear the Sabre glove, then you might get a little cut on the wrist or something that impedes handling the weapon. And so now you've got to call this thing off. Everybody goes home, you heal up, and then, you know, in a couple of weeks when everybody's better again, you come back and you repeat this mess. And so that was the big reason that they used that Sabre glove. And first blood as a standard was problematic because it was not a medical decision. That was a decision that was made by the seconds. And if the seconds somehow missed a cut, you know, maybe it wasn't bleeding, or they thought it wasn't bleeding, they restarted, and then somebody gets killed on the next engagement, you could have a real legal problem when somebody says, but hey, you already had first blood. And those seconds have absolutely no legal immunity at all, where the doctors had immunity. And so that was why that severe wound from which one of them cannot continue was such an important standard, because it let the seconds be safe, and it shifted that decision over onto the doctors who, you know, that was just another day for them. And as far as the forearm guard, that was only for Sabre. And generally the rest of what you were allowed was a dress shirt, trousers. Often it's said that you weren't allowed to have a starched shirt. In an epee or spotted duel, you were essentially allowed a standard unstuffed fencing glove or a street glove, and that was about it. Okay, as far as the Kvaten, the new Sabre, I haven't seen it. They have promised me that they're going to send me a couple of prototypes to test. Last I heard from them was months ago, and they were having some issues trying to figure out how to replicate some of the parts in volume. I noticed somebody sold one on Facebook on the Military Classical page a couple of weeks ago, and I don't know if that was the original one from the summer when they first released that and then reached out to me after. But I noticed that the alignment between the first 1/3, the strong part of the blade, and the grip was kind of like this, and it looked pretty awful. And that was one of the things that I had commented on initially was, golly gee, guys, you need to really fix that and get that alignment correct, because otherwise it's really not going to be useful. That's kind of the problem with the current Hanwei Pecoraro, so-called Pecoraro Sabre, is that you really need to cut the tab end that goes into the backstrap. You really need to cut that off and drill a new hole, reshape the tab about an inch below where it was before, because somehow when they created these things, they left the knuckle bow about an inch longer than it's supposed to be. And if you adjust that when you put the new blade in it, you end up much happier.
Right, I'm not seeing any more questions. I'll bloviate for a wee bit more in case anybody's got some ruminations here. So I just wanted to say, we'll be, as I mentioned, myself, Sala de la Spada, we'll be doing these about once or twice a month. In about 2 weeks, I'm looking to have Maestro Francesca Loda from Rome give a presentation on Marcelli and the rapier system. because of the time difference with Italy, I'm sure Michael here is very sympathetic to this, the time difference to the Czech Republic. I'm probably going to do this on the weekend, so probably a Saturday or Sunday in late March, about noonish East Coast Standard Time, which would be for those of you in Europe, about 5-6 o'clock, depending upon your location in Europe. But normally I do these on a Tuesday night. I have a few of my diehard students, Larry, who have Tuesday nights off. So I try to make sure that people like Larry and others can come to the meetings. But again, and if you have further ideas, some of you, this is not your first time with these talks. If you have certain people or subjects you want to listen about, or even if you want to present on, let me know, right? And one of the things I'm trying to do here is to, again, as I said, try to get more of this history and theory out with experts like Chris, who are doing the translation, grew up in the style, and can really share a lot of this information, because we don't always have the ability to pick up these old military journals in Italian and read them. At least I don't. So a way of getting that information to us all. And also just to sometimes ask questions of the authors. So a lot of you asked some excellent questions of Chris, these tricky actions like the counter parries, like the Sforza di Cambiamento, that are not easy to see, Corey, 2 questions. Are there ways to, if you give me your email address, if you send it to me it's my email address for the Sala is saladillaspada@gmail.com. I will type it in the chat right now. And I have an email list of students and others that I send out the links. Because again, yes, not everybody's on Facebook. I'm very sympathetic to not being on Facebook. For previous speakers, I have not gotten things recorded yet, but moving forward, we're looking to record these. This time we did Google, and I will plead mea culpa. I do not have a professional Google email account, and you have to have a professional one to do the recording. But we did do the one with John Sullins. That is recorded. So if you want to link to that, email me. And the one with John Sullins from 2 weeks ago, we do have recorded. And I'm going to look to try and record more of these in the future. Any last minute questions for Chris before we wrap up here? Oh, somebody wants your slide deck.
The slides are in the link that was shared earlier. Well, and I shut that one down. If somebody, let's see if we can find this again. Here we go. Copy link address, paste, enter. Okay, so the Dropbox link here has my slides. It has my speaker notes. It's got a couple of excerpts from the 1868 or 9 Del Frate about the choice of the saber. Mazziello's little chunks from a couple of his books on the cutting mechanics, and a few other little things in there. Jelly's article on Radielli from Army in, I think, 1930 or 32. So there's a few little things that are there. Most of those, I think, if you have my translation of the 1873 Cavalry Regs, Book 1, I included those in the back of the book just because I wanted to get them out there for people to see it. But that was about all that's in that pack. As far as translation stuff goes, what I look at on this is, first and foremost, you absolutely positively must render clean, clear, readable English. If you don't, you have absolutely failed as a translator. If you leave horrible translation ease because somebody hopes that they might find some hidden meaning in something, you have failed as a translator. Terminology, for example, in Del Frate, I tried to keep to using his terminology so that if we looked back, or if somebody wanted to look back at the Italian, we could all make that match up. Does it create issues? Well, yeah, because Del Frate calls a yielding parry what we would call today a circular parry, and what some schools call a counter parry. And you can end up in real messes linguistically with people really confused about what you're getting at. So I tried really hard to just use his terms as best I could, and then to define those terms. Otherwise, there are things in Italian where, now fortunately we don't see it very much in the 19th century books, but we see it a lot in the 17th, 18th century stuff where things are written in the subjunctive for absolutely no reason, probably in a sort of sense of excessive obsequious politeness. If my lord would extend the arm and would lunge, so that you're not ordering around this guy that has way more social power than you do. So you see a lot of that, and it is absolutely painful. It's painful reading in English, and it's really stilted. And so, for example, in Marcelli and in Pallavicini, where it didn't seem to indicate, where the subjunctive use didn't seem to indicate would or should, I dumped it and rendered it into the indicative, because it doesn't add anything and it just makes a big mess. So there's things like that. There's also issues that you get into with more complicated sequence of tenses than we have in English. And so you have to render those down into an English sequence of tenses so that you don't just end up with, really clumsy stuff. I see some translations floating around where people leave adjectives and nouns in the inverted Italian order. So just like in Spanish, and I think French as well, instead of a red ball in English, you have ball red, which is just clumsy and means very little to us in English. And we're left going, what just happened here? Am I having a stroke or what? And then we see things like, one of these fun pieces that is floating around where somebody translated espadon as swordfish. Apparently not able to look, 2 entries down in the dictionary to see that it was just the name of whatever it was. What was it, Patrick? A spadroon or a saber or something?
That's where spadroon comes from. A cut and thrust sword is espadon, right?
So you have this translation full of swordfish. I mean, is that a one-handed swordfish? Is it a cut and thrust swordfish? Do we use it like a rifle and bayonet? I'm really not sure. But it's just one of those things that you have to have a bit of a nonsense detector. Things have to pass the sniff test. And when they don't make any sense, you have to stop and go, wait a minute, what's going on here? And you have to go back and you have to reread that chunk and try to figure out what the context is or what you might be missing. Jelly's stuff has been really fun as a translator because he's dropping little cultural allusions that were small at the time, maybe. He comments that Parise, in Parise's lessons, because he puts forth the fact that Parise didn't actually teach a whole lot, he more administered. He says that he could tell us the story of Parise's lessons in a chapter that he could title The Green Carpet or Sugar Water. Well, you go digging in a deep dive on books.google, and what you find is that there was another book written about the same time. So maybe it had a common source, or maybe this is something that Jelly had read, where Parliament was referred to as being like a room with the green carpeted tables. Well, the gaming tables. And the sugar water reference is that speakers at Parliament were offered a glass of sugar water at the lectern. So what he's saying is that Parise spent more time gambling and politicking than he did teaching. And so you find these things and you're kind of like, wait, what? Or sometimes it's just, it's figures of speech that don't make any sense in English. That someone has a good cabbage That doesn't mean anything to us. Salt in their head. They're just different ways of saying that people are smart or have brains. And I tend not to translate those things literally because they don't mean anything to us in English. So if nothing else, I'll put an equivalent, and if I really feel like it was something that was fun, then I'll put a footnote in about it.
I'll add one thing, because that's kind of a pet peeve of mine. So I'll speak a little bit on this, Chris. One of the things I'll mention, I talked to Steve and Chris a lot about this. So I read French pretty well. And one thing that's interesting to me is I look at a lot of the existing French translations of fencing texts. And one of the things that often hampers the translation is if the author wants to do a literal translation and doesn't consider how fencing terms and theories have evolved over time, or how the language presents things. So like in French, and Steve might laugh as I talk about this, but in French, there's actually really not an easy way to distinguish cut from thrust. It's a coup, as we would call a blow, like coup d'etat in English, right? You would say coup d'etat is the coup of the state. So you have to kind of read the context. Is this a coup? Is it a strike with a point or a strike with the edge? But if you're just reading a text that says coup, right, you could say, okay, that's a blow. And so next thing you know, like your saber, your small sword text has no thrust in it, right? Because you just translate. Well, the small sword would be kind of silly, right? A whole small sword text with no thrusting, right? Or you could do things like, and Chris mentions this in Parise's book, not all Italian and French texts from the 19th century specify a modern term for lunge, like a fondo or fond or something like this, right? And so, yeah. So if you read these books and you get your Google Translate out and you say, well, there's no affondo, so that meant Parise didn't lunge, right? Which, if you look at the pictures, he's obviously lunging. And so those are some things that I see often in the translations, where you see the person doing it probably either had a literal translation or hadn't experienced reading various texts from the time to see how they present information or how fencing language. And some of you who have done older fencing, you can think about how imbroccata has changed over time, or fianconata, right? These things in the 17th, the 18th, 20th century mean different things, right? It's the same Italian or French term, right? So anyways, I'll stop there, but I think it's really important.
Well, yeah, and another one that's fun that we see all the time in a lot of these rapier texts, people are translating tirar as push, when really this is a fencing specific sort of use of the verb. You're not going to find it in a dictionary, but when you really read the context of it, what you actually have is perform. He's telling you perform a thrust. And if we did it like, Parise, I think, does it still to an extent. Marcelli does it. Pallavicini does it. But there's not much push when you're here. When you're already extended in guard, there's no push left. Can I shove my shoulder up? Well, yeah, that's not a good idea. I don't want to give people the idea that that's what we're looking for. Are we throwing a punch? No. So I made the distinction and the decision that, I'm going to treat that as a fencing specific verb, and I'm going to render, unless there's some reason not to, I'm going to render tirar as perform, just as though it was eseguire. Oh, yeah, Patrick, that's exactly right. Pago agere, do, drive, discuss, debate. I mean, it means just about anything. It's a generic action verb. And you can do whatever you want with it. So does anybody else have any, since we're just kind of hanging out here, does anybody have any questions relating to any of the books, any of the Radielli technical material? Arian, if you're still here, you got anything? Anybody?
Patrick, I think Arian left.
Okay.
Patrick and then Scott have got questions.
Patrick, I have no idea. In the 1910 Italian Fencing Federation rules, which were that was the first edition of them. The foils, as I recall, I don't have it in front of me, but the foils had a max weight between like 420 or 460 grams at the minimum. And the maximum for the foil was something like 720 or 740 grams. It's an incredibly heavy foil. The Smara that Castile made, those come in about 580 grams. Patrick, you've got that Spada with the brass hilt, and I think that one's 680, and it's a really heavy brass hilt, and that's that's not even 700 grams. So I don't know where we come up with something quite that heavy. I guess we could cast it in lead, maybe.
Okay, then Scott on the imbricata.
Oh, well, so imbrocata in the old books simply means a thrust where the hand is palmed down. And so we could make an imbrocata in, hand in second position, but we could make that imbrocata to the high line. If I back up here or turn. So, hand in second to the high line, that's an imbrocata in some books. Roseroll, I think, does it that way. Certainly Marcelli and Pallavicini look at it that way, where a pronate or a supinated thrust was stoccata. But even by Marcelli's time, and certainly by Roseroll's time, very often they simply say in the Italian stoccata, and they use that as the generic thrust term rather than really caring about whether it's palm up or down, and then they'll specify the hand position. And then very late, early 20th century, we start to see the imbrocata take this meaning of only to the low line and almost always as some sort of a counterattack. And it really does change over time. Likewise, the fiancanata sometimes just means any blow to the flank. Marcelli takes it as like an intagliata, an oblique lunge to the inside, and then recovers the rear foot so that you're completely off the line. And that's just another one of those things that changes. Intrecciata is and I'm going to always get this confused. Battuta di contro is a circular beat. The change beat is intrecciata in Parise, but in Pallavicini and I think Marcelli, it's essentially a sort of bound thrust, kind of like fiancanata and quarta. So these things just do change over time. Left-handed question. Honestly, the big thing to me is that as left-handers, we always are fighting to stay on the inside most of the time, and we should never, ever lose sight of the fact that often under the arm is very open under the arm to the flank is very open for our opponents, as it is for us. Usually left-handers have great parry 4 and not so great parry 3. So you'll find that where a lot of Italian theory will tell us, well, gosh, we're going to do a fiancanata in quarta in epee or spada. A left-hander isn't going to tend to do that action much because you'll tend to run into it with your leg. But instead, we're going to do fiancanata in terza exactly the same way. And that's what gets us to that outside flank. And that's a great action. Otherwise, to be perfectly honest, it's just a matter of being used to the actions. I think good instructors teach on both sides. I know when I was learning to teach, my late maestro made me learn to fence well enough right-handed to give lessons right-handed. And so I kind of alternate fairly often back and forth, because you want to make sure that your students are capable of getting up there and realizing that really nothing has changed here. All of your own actions are the same with very few exceptions. So that's kind of the best advice I can give you. Otherwise, a lot of the older books, Marcelli, Roserl, they have long sections on advice for left-handers. But the truth of the matter is that I really don't think it's that different, and it just doesn't bother me anymore.
Okay. We're at about 9:20, a little over, but we lost many people had to go, but I thought we would keep the questions going as long as Chris was there. So if there's no other questions, if you guys could all just join me in thanking Chris for taking the time to spend so much time with us and talk about all sorts of questions and all sorts of neat things about history and theory. So very much appreciated.
Well, thanks for listening to me stumble through this.
Yep.